Hello, and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Giselle Donnelly, and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by my colleagues,
Yulia Joja with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington Universities, and
Dalibor Rohac, also with AEI.
On our podcast, we talk about the many challenges to European peace that have emerged along a line which runs from the Baltic to the Black Sea, what we call the Eastern Front, and about why these issues matter to the United States. Today is just going to be the three of us sort of catching up on the events, not only the last several weeks, but the last several months. And if you enjoy our conversation, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks and welcome. My dear friends, I propose the sort of following structure for our conversation today. And to begin with sort of a potted analysis of how the Russians have changed their approach to the war. They continue to defend doggedly and with some success the territory that they've acquired in Ukraine from 2014 until now, while continuing strikes on civilian targets, but not just apartment buildings. They've, in particular, started to go after the grain industry, if you will, in Ukraine, not only attacking port facilities where grain is stored prior to shipment out of the country, but also ports along the Danube on the border with Romania, which is a pretty dicey move, you would have to say. So I propose that we begin by analyzing the Black Sea flank, if we can call it that, and then work backwards to a general discussion about where we are in the war and what might be coming down the pike. How's that sound?
that sounds very good.
Okay, so who wants to lead us off? Dalibor, you want to take the first swing?
Sounds great. So I just want to pick up on perhaps one element of what you mentioned, Giselle, which is this new approach undertaken by Russia, which consists of focusing on the destruction of Ukrainian grain export infrastructure, because that's what a big part of the news over the past couple of weeks has been about. There is a deliberate effort to not only follow up on the withdrawal from the grains deal, but to proactively make it impossible for Ukrainians to get their grain exports out to their normal destinations. It's an odd strategy in the following sense, which is that to some extent, Putin, since the beginning of the war, has relied on the non-aligned nations not going along with the Western alliance in holding Russia accountable. And now he is effectively holding them hostage in a way and using this sort of extortionary weapon with, who knows what goal in mind. But I wonder if it's going to work. I mean, you look at the pictures from the recent Russia-Africa summit with fewer than 20 African leaders and heads of government attending, compared to 43 out of the 54 heads of government attending in 2019 at the most recent iteration of the summit. And I think it takes, people in the West always criticize the sort of post-colonial orientalizing mindset with regard to the third world and developing countries. And what we are seeing coming from Moscow is like, how do you call that other than a sort of post-colonial approach? Like you sort of, in a very sort of public and visible way, you disrupt the supply of important commodity for these countries, and then you offer a handout when Russia sort of offered some sort of modest sort of supply of grains for free to these countries. And I think these leaders would be foolish to fall for it. And I think that sort of amount, that sort of reservoir of goodwill or trust or whatnot towards Russia must be wearing thin in some quarters. Obviously, there are other things going on in Africa. The Russian-sponsored coup in Niger and that whole sort of belt of Russian influence in the sort of north of the sort of sub-Saharan Africa. But I think this might be one of the sort of theaters to watch out in the coming months to sort of see whether Russian power and influence starts to crumble or whether it becomes more entrenched. And I don't think I would bet on the latter, to be honest.
Let me ask you, is it possible to fit these actions, which in some sense just sort of look like the only thing they could come up with, because at best the Ukraine war is at a stalemate? Russia's opportunities for further conquest have basically vanished. And the question is, do they have enough people and equipment to retain their toeholds that they have, and in particular, the Crimea? So it seems like they're just trying to wreck as much of Ukraine as they possibly can. But also, as you rightly suggest, this is, what goes on in Ukraine and what goes on with Ukrainian grain doesn't stay there. Do they imagine that they will be the substitute grain provider to the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa? I just don't see where this leads, I have to say.
I think that's part, and I'm not sure anybody does. I mean, it's, throwing the kitchen sink at the problem with the expectation that enough chaos will be created that will somehow be to the Kremlin's benefit in the end, with whether it has to do with, opening up markets for Russian grain exports themselves, or whether it is about just instigating chaos in sub-Saharan Africa and a sort of food insecurity situation that will drive up more people across the Mediterranean to Europe in a way that would be disruptive to European politics and make it harder for leaders like Meloni to keep her focus on the war. So I don't believe that there is a sort of 5-dimensional chess strategy behind this. I think it's one of those instances which we've seen in the past where Putin just tries different things, pulls different threads, and sees what works.
And I think it's also a matter of how long-term or short-term Putin, Russia generally can think right now. Because what people maybe focus less on with this grain is that there's kind of several qualities of grain, the EU level, and I think Dalibor will talk about that in a second. Then there's Ukraine. But before we get to that, on Russia, the Ukraine grain is much higher quality than the Russia grain. And Russia has not produced as much this year as in previous years. But what they are, to me, trying to do by what you're referring to earlier, Giselle, bombing grain infrastructure, is to increase the price so that they can cash in now, short term to medium term, as much as possible for their bad quality grain, with which, of course, they will finance the war machine. And so the Africans are not thrilled about that grain being expensive. And a lot of the Ukrainian grain was going to China, and now China has to buy more expensive, and it is lower quality overall on the market. Everybody's unhappy. It's like a lose-lose thing. But for Russia, for now, it fixes the problem of them cashing in this process, destroying as much of Ukraine and having third countries suffer as much as possible, with, for them, that being actually a plus rather than a minus, a benefit rather than a cost short term, right?
Well, the China aspect is kind of an interesting one, especially considering that as things have played out, it has accelerated the trend of Moscow being the second banana to Beijing, with the Chinese taking steps to keep their dependency. The Russians are selling them cheap oil and gas and stuff, but the Chinese have sort of prevaricated on building more pipelines and so on. And so the Chinese want a variety of, they care a lot about natural resources of all sorts, but they're also very wary of becoming too dependent on individual suppliers. So if you're really Machiavellian, you can think maybe that the Russians are trying to build back some leverage in their relationship with Beijing. Maybe I'm like way overthinking it. I think you're both probably right that Putin is just trying whatever comes to hand.
I think this is one of those areas where I think there is a real divergence of interests between Beijing and Moscow, in the sense that the Chinese, if they're gearing up for a possible confrontation with the United States, if they are thinking about the US decoupling and so on and so forth, they have a vested interest in keeping their connectivity with Europe alive and sort of healthy and vibrant as much as possible. And so I don't know whether I heard it on this podcast or...
But that's going south too. The Italians are pulling out of the Belt and Road Initiative, which, I don't follow Italian politics. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so it's not going well for the Chinese, that's for sure. But one sort of snippet of which might be a sort of factoid that's true, but I would encourage everybody to fact check it, because it can also be misinformation. But there was a little sort of rumor that was floated, maybe on this podcast, maybe elsewhere on the internet, namely that the Chinese tried to dissuade Russia from bombing Ukrainian railway infrastructure to the extent to which the Russians would be keen to do. And I mean, it does make a certain amount of sense given the very impressive state in which Ukrainian railways find themselves. They might play a role in sort of broader Chinese scheme of things in which you want to keep that sort of transit corridor alive and safe. So that's just a side note. You were going to say something.
Yeah, this is not from this podcast because it's the first time I hear it, but it does make sense to me. The question, rather, I think, is of nuance: how much they're trying to dissuade and how much we are interpreting in the media, or building too much into it. But China has very little interest in grain infrastructure being destroyed, partially because a lot of it is going again to China, and railways include that part of transportation, and part because China has invested serious money in this. They're not just have been dependent on and very much investing into balancing out the imports of food really into China, but Ukraine has been a key part of that because, of course, the fertile soil of the region. And China does own 10% of Ukraine's agricultural surface, 9-10%, something like that. That's a lot of surface and a lot of money. So they're probably trying to dissuade things like that. But the question is how much Russia is listening and how much they're really, weighing in and saying, well, we won't give you this or that if you continue to do that. Or they're just, strongly condemning what Russia is doing.
I have to say that especially the longer the conflict continues, the notion that this is just a border dispute confined to a backward corner of the world is just harder and harder to sustain. The implications for feeding the world, for supplying the world, for the international economy more broadly, let alone the balance of power, both in Europe and sort of globally, actually, it is really quite striking. And also quite striking is how slowly the global import of the war is dawning on the political conversation, at least in the United States, but maybe also in Europe, too.
Well, so that's, I think, the other sort of side of this, which we haven't really delved into. So, there is a sort of pressure on Western leaders, possibly coming from a food insecurity crisis in Africa and resulting, migratory flows towards Europe. But there is already a sort of crisis underway in the Ukrainian-Polish, Ukrainian-Slovak, Ukrainian-Romanian relations that's linked directly to this grain problem. So Ukraine, is a huge agriculture producer, the largest exporter in the world of sunflower oil, the fourth largest exporter in the world of corn, seventh largest exporter of wheat, and there has been effort made following the attacks on Odessa to get Ukrainian grain out of the country via rail through neighboring countries. And the problem with that is that land transport is really expensive. I mean, people don't do that in normal times. And so it doesn't really pay to take, grains long distances on the railway or on trucks. And so what happened was that much of this grain, which was nominally destined to be sold elsewhere, ended up countries like Poland or Slovakia, prompting a backlash from local farmers. Now, you can say, in the end, grain is fungible, right? So like, these countries already are facing food inflation because of, the disruptions to these chains, but I mean, these local interest groups are very well organized, and if they see surplus grain coming from Ukraine, they immediately sort of snap at the opportunity to stop it. And initially, the countries neighboring Ukraine implemented unilaterally, without asking Brussels for permission, bans on imports, which were then kind of ex post facto legalized by Brussels, by European Union. I mean, in normal times, it's really unthinkable that countries are not supposed to have their independent sort of trade policies in the European Union, but it was just impossible to sort of resist that kind of pressure.
Well, tell that to French farmers. This is the kind of chaotic situation that's particularly difficult for the EU to handle, right?
That's right. So basically, the Commission in the end just went along with whatever those affected countries decided. There is a ban on imports in place until the 15th of September, and only transit of grains is permitted, which means that unless there is like an itinerary for a specific shipping container to go all the way somewhere else, it is not allowed on the territory of, say, Poland or Slovakia. And in the past, there were instances where some sort of like illegal machinations were made once the grain was inside the country. But they are fighting really hard to stop that. So there's very little that gets in as of now. And that obviously places a burden on the Ukrainian agricultural sector. And the whole crisis escalated to the point when one of the advisors to the Polish president repeated this line, or that originated with Ben Wallace and then Jake Sullivan, about how Ukrainians should be more grateful for all they're getting. And that was a sort of, for me, a sort of unexpected low point in what otherwise has been a very strong relationship between Poland and Ukraine. And Ukrainians in return summoned the ambassador. I think there had been now an effort made to sort of reconcile the two countries. But I mean, that is something that very much plays into the hands of Putin and the Kremlin. Maybe that was not primary intended effect, but it's part of the play.
Well, it fulfills his lone remaining strategy is for dissolution among the West, and he's you have to say that the pause, if you will, between the Ukrainian successes of last year and where we are now have been a time that's really gone begging or gone to waste. And we are now beginning to reap the consequences of that, I think. I mean, not only in the political wrangling, but we want to shift to a discussion of the war itself.
Maybe before that, I'll just make one sort of little side note, which I might have made on this podcast before, which is that it is somewhat dispiriting to see this backlash against Ukrainian grain imports happening in countries that are otherwise the closest friends and allies that Ukraine has inside of the European Union. Because the plan right now is for Ukraine at some point to join the EU. At that point, it can be expected that Ukraine will have a large and very competitive agricultural sector that will produce lots of cheap grain, right? I mean, it's 11% of Ukraine's GDP, agriculture, relative compared to 2% EU average. 14% of Ukrainians work in agriculture or worked before the war. And so once Ukraine is inside the EU, I mean, Ukrainian grain will be very much part of the single market. And it's a sort of repetition of the same debate that the EU had before the Polish accession to the EU. And as a result of that process, reforms done to the common agricultural policy, I think common agricultural policy, even in its reformed form, is certainly unsustainable with a country like Ukraine inside the EU. And so I think, that's a sort of difficult conversation to be had given the politics of it, but it's an inevitable one. And I would have almost hoped for a sort of more constructive approach from the sort of political leaderships of these countries. Sort of, to put it in this broader context and say that, yeah, I mean, we'll have cheap grains competing against our grain.
Yulia and Dalibor, explain this to me. I mean, just thinking of the example of Poland, which has tried to style itself as the bedrock or keystone of the Eastern Front, spending a ton of money on expanding and modernizing its military, et cetera, has been stalwart in taking in Ukrainian refugees and being the conduit for resupply of the Ukrainian army. And again, to me, that's the most obvious example, but this might be a good time to walk up and down the Eastern Front to see which way the trend lines are going. Yulia, I mean, the Romanians were sort of watching the fireworks display across the Danube as the Russians rocketed the ports, and you were there recently. To whom you spoke, what were they saying?
Well, so I was not there near the border where these things happen, but it still felt pretty close in that there was a second round of these bombings, and people are across the Danube River from on the Ukrainian side in the Danube Delta, and people that live in that region are pretty freaked out. And I think it's about, well, I know it is about the war feeling literally that it is getting closer. And frankly, from kind of a grand perspective, not listening to, what is happening in this corner or the other, it does look like, and I think you were alluding to that at the beginning too, it does look like Russia is seriously escalating, and it's escalating not just against Ukraine, but against the powers that it perceives it is fighting an indirect war with, which is NATO. Because on the one side, I think Russia bombing Ukrainian grain facilities is to increase the price for short and medium term calculations. But the other thing is to provoke, to escalate, to see how NATO is reacting. So 2 rounds of bombing in the Danube Delta, and second time around the other day, just the village that is across the ports on the other side of the river, the Romanian village window shattered. And someone could have died or gotten injured. And people in that region don't feel safe anymore. And they're really frustrated with the Romanian government, who has been saying in both cases of these bombings, no, NATO territory is safe, and has not decided to invoke Article 4 for consultations with NATO. It keeps saying, we're safe under NATO. The first round of bombings, something was invoked, but it was invoked by Zelensky, not by Romania. And Romania played its card of, we're going to stay discreet, and didn't issue any complaints, not even in the press statement from that first NATO-Ukraine Council. Bulgaria was actually louder, arguing in the first round, we'll see what happens if there is a second round, was arguing that the war zone that I think we mentioned in the previous episode with Admiral Fogo, the war zone that Russia is now officially operating in is biting into the exclusive economic zone of Bulgaria. So big time into the Romanian one, which means also that gas drilling is getting more expensive. There's another cost to NATO territory, directly or indirectly. Grain has gotten more expensive. Insurance is up by 35%. So all these direct and indirect, now with the window shattering, costs that NATO territory and NATO, so to speak, citizens are bearing have no reflection whatsoever in how the Romanian government has responded the second time around too. The statements from the president and the prime minister are about serious concern and serious condemnation. But I want to add one more thing to this. So on the one side, Russia is clearly escalating, and the target, they could have chosen not to bomb there 200 meters from NATO border. The target is the entity with which they're fighting, but the escalation is happening because of NATO leaders, and in this case, particularly the Romania too, but particularly the Biden administration's response. I think there was a statement following the first round of bombing from maybe it's the White House spokesperson saying, we don't want to bring ships into the Black Sea, but rather we want to bring grain out of the Black Sea. That's like a false dichotomy altogether. But apart from, kind of manipulative of a statement, it also is based on the logic of, if we only don't get into Russia's way, they will not be escalating. And Admiral Fogo on the last episode mentioned how the NATO maritime presence that was in the Black Sea was withdrawn to not create a conflict, to not escalate months before the full-scale invasion. And now we have nothing. And it's counterfactual, but nevertheless, I've been arguing for a while before the full-scale invasion for a Danube presence of NATO, or maritime or semi-maritime presence, because Turkey is blocking any other presence. If that would have been there, this wouldn't have happened, right? Because that's deterrence. And Russia wants to escalate and provoke, but not as much as affecting directly or attacking directly NATO military assets. But because we don't have anything, and with that, I'll wrap up my examples. The Romanian, in the first round, a Romanian ship got damaged. And over the last year and a bit, several demining equipments, which NATO should be providing, but it is not in the Black Sea region, have also been destroyed, Romanian ones, because of the Russian floating mines. So it's an escalation and an addition of costs for NATO directly. But our response is, no, we cannot bring anything in because that would mean that we can't bring anything out. It just doesn't make sense.
Oh, you've had your Romanian Black Sea limit for today. I do thank you for not going down the rat hole of Bulgarian politics, although I think we should maybe do a show on that sometime soon because there's a lot spinning up there and it is even harder for an American to understand than anything else. Dalibor, now explain Poland and the rest of the EU to us.
Well, so the Polish situation, I think, is to some extent quite straightforward. So Poland's agricultural sector is smaller than Ukraine's, but it's sizable. There's an election in October. The governing Law and Justice Party relies heavily on support from rural areas, from smallholder farmers, etc., etc. So this is an important constituency, and so it's not altogether surprising that they would be very sort of pliable on this. And so the government really went out of their way to say, yeah, we support Ukraine, we've been helping Ukraine, but when it comes to agricultural exports, like we have to prioritize the interests of our farmers. So it's not not altogether surprising, but it is, in my view, still a failure of political leadership to some extent to fail to explain to the sort of the complexities of it and just set it into this broader framework, which involves Ukraine becoming a member of the EU in the future. And it also makes sure that people's minds are focused on what the real threat is here. And I do fear that this Russian approach of just like throwing the kitchen sink at the problem and creating all kinds of different sources of chaos, rising insurance rates, rising food prices, migratory crisis, etc., that it will sort of, without reliable political leadership that can sort of connect the dots and present an accurate picture to the voting public, that you'll have an electorate in any country that will be increasingly kind of tired and demoralized and will want this war to just go away, regardless of how that happens. And Slovakia, which is where I'm recording from right now, has gone down that path much further than some of the other countries. So I can share some poll numbers with you from May from a Globsec survey that asked people across Central and Eastern Europe about their opinion on who is to blame for the war. And in Slovakia, you have 34% of the public that's blaming the war on the West and 17% of the public that's blaming it on Ukraine itself. So basically a majority of people who blame either Ukraine or the West, only 40% of Slovaks who blame it on Russia. In comparison, 85% of Poles blame this situation on Russia, and correctly so. And so Slovakia is another country that's going to have an election this fall. We don't know, what sort of coalition will emerge out of that, but there is strong pro-Russian undercurrent, and that is constraining the choices of different party leaders. And it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy because, again, without that political sort of leadership making an active case for why, we need Ukraine to win, I mean, the public opinion just drifts in ways that then make it harder to make that case later on.
Let me propose a slight change to the remaining agenda. First of all, our next program will be a war-related program. Our schedule for next Friday includes that. Therefore, I'm going to suggest that for the last few minutes here, we remain at this macro 30,000 geostrategic level. And let me frame a proposition for the three of us to discuss. And just to put it in the broadest terms, that there's been a fundamental misunderstanding of what this war is about. Is it about A, preserving the status quo in Europe, or B, creating something new in Europe, a new balance of power, a new order that may renew the liberal principles upon which the European and transatlantic projects have long been founded, but again, is not just the restoration of the status quo, but the creation of new structures and a new order to achieve the traditional ends. I'll just go first. And, I think it's much more, I've said this occasionally before, but the longer this goes on, the more I believe it is. It's much more about creating something new. Again, not new in terms of its fundamental political principles or the ideas that give political institutions their coherence, but it's about what was incomplete before, Europe whole and free, as the man once said, but dealing with and we've suggested a number of ways in which even a successful outcome of this war would make for pretty substantial changes in the various European political and economic architectures that previously existed. I also think it's a big challenge for American strategy as well that requires in this regard, the Biden administration has not fulfilled the role that sort of the times are demanding of it to help Europe get to that different future. So without going into every little jot and tittle as to why that's my attitude toward things, I'd be interested in hearing from the two of you as to how you see this.
Dalibor, if I may, I'll go next and I'll let you go last because I have the suspicion that you'll come up with something far better. I think it's also a matter of you've arrived before me on the closer to the Eastern Front. And so I am a little bit marked by talking to people here and I guess their pessimism or their skepticism and sometimes, unfortunately, cynicism when it comes to what the future will look like based on obvious reasons. The fact that we don't really have in Central and Eastern Europe much of an incident or a relative historical example of things working out the way people would want them to, right? That makes a difference in quality and in how people in Ukraine, in Romania, in Poland, in Slovakia look at the region. And I think I'm colored by that being here for a while and talking to people and asking them about their opinion, including about this thing, the new order or same order. And so with that in mind, two very small things or small additions to this. The one thing is exactly what I was mentioning, and that is I feel that people off the Eastern Front oftentimes have difficulty imagining either a complete reorientation or transformation or just a preserving of status quo either way when looking at this war, because it seems so destructive and so different from what people would have expected in its outreach and how big of a war it is, that colors the perspective, if that makes sense too. I think there's very big, and I see it, skepticism here that there is a good outcome under the current political circumstances, including in Washington, D.C. The lack of resolution of this administration and the fact that the administration is running out of time and the fear of what could come next when it comes to the pivot of the United States away from this war. Think Trump. Both these things are coloring the perspective of what could come after this. And now setting the a bit negative perspective here aside, to answer your question, the second point, maybe to me it's something in the middle, because I think if we presume a good positive outcome of this war, which is the prerequisite of either status quo or a transformation of the transatlantic space in terms of including institutional structures, doesn't that come with it? If Ukraine becomes the victor, the winner of this war, and it becomes integrated into NATO and the EU with the mere size and experience, that will by itself shift the power balance of both institutions and in a way transform them. I know that's not very revolutionary, but to me, this is then answering your question of it goes into transformation, but by itself through Ukraine's victory.
I would say that Ukraine has kicked open the door that can't really be shut easily. That would lead to the real collapse of the westernizing project.
I think things would really have to go south in Ukraine for that door to be shut in a durable way. So to answer your question, Giselle, I'll probably follow Julia's even-handed approach, and I'll say obviously it's a bit of both, right? So Putin has defied the status quo by trying to redraw borders in Europe in the 21st century, by trying to set up fake countries. And so in a way, the pushback that he's getting is an attempt to restore a sort of rules-based international system on the European continent. But I think that's only a small part of the story, and I think the bigger part of the story is this opportunity to build something new in Europe that would be better than the sort of system and red lines and borders, so to speak, that were drawn in the 1990s. It's an opportunity to move Ukraine in a durable way from the post-Soviet space, and Ukrainians themselves have tried to move their country in that direction on numerous occasions, starting with the 2004 Orange Revolution, with the Revolution of Dignity, and now when you look at Ukraine, I mean, they're very much an effort to just turn Ukraine into a normal European country through candidate status, the EU, through the association agreement, through the pressure to join NATO. You see this massive leapfrogging in terms of domestic reforms that Ukrainians have been undertaking. And I mean, this is something that gives me a lot of optimism. I'm impressed with every conversation with like individual Ukrainians I've been having, whether it's on the podcast or whether it's the lady who runs a little patisserie shop here in Slovakia, who's a Ukrainian refugee, and I think it is a stark departure from this mentality that Julia alluded to, namely this notion, which I encounter a lot in places like the Czech Republic or Slovakia or Hungary, which basically attitude that commands you to just keep your head down, right? Like it's the sort of the grand course of history, like that's for the great powers. Like we in Central Europe, we shouldn't try to stick up too much. Let's keep our heads down, and the Germans, Americans, Russians will decide things. And I think that's ultimately what Orban's approach to foreign policy boils down to. Like, so if you can sort of kick the smaller ones and be a sort of local bully, but you don't want to alienate any of the great powers of the world. And in a way, Ukraine kind of forces these countries to pick sides, and they've in a way picked sides already, and it is for the good. And unless again things go really south in Ukraine, I am more optimistic about the prospects of this part of the world than I was before the war itself started.
All right, so we always do try to end on a positive note, and maybe that's become so ingrained in us that shaped Dalibor's response there, but I'll take it. I appreciate the two of you indulging me in my inflating one trial balloon after another. I always learn a lot from you. So from me, Giselle Donnelly, and
Julia Zoja, and
Dalibor Rohac.
Thanks to our listeners for indulging our rambling conversations on the Eastern Front. This podcast is dedicated to the security challenges that have arisen along the line from the Baltic to the Black Sea. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, aei.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please be in touch with us on Twitter, or X, as we are now obligated to call it, using the hashtag Eastern Front Pod, written as one word. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.